Welcome sports fans to GenX Classic Sports, where we bring the nostalgia of our sports-filled youth into the present day. Grab your favorite retro jersey, crack open a cold one, and let's stroll down memory lane together.
Welcome back, everyone, to GenX Classic Sports. I'm your host, Sean Enos, and man, we've got a fun one today, okay? We're sticking with baseball, Major League Baseball, and you know, we like to talk about individual players and teams and championships and all kinds of things, but sometimes we just talk about what I call events. Just things that maybe weren't planned that just kind of happen and become historic, right? So this is one of those. This is one of the most unforgettable events from back in the old golden age of sports. This is the era many of us grew up in, and this was before luxury suites and billion-dollar TV deals. And this was back when ballparks were louder and the promotions were a little bit crazier. And sometimes things got a little bit out of control. And I've been waiting to talk about this one for a long time. And so today we're talking about a night that perfectly captures sort of the mood of that era. And this was a promotion so infamous that Major League Baseball still talks about it 50 years later. This is the night when beer cost a dime and fans stormed the field and players grabbed bats to defend themselves and a baseball game ended in a forfeit because of a riot. This is the story of 10-cent beer night at Cleveland Municipal Stadium in 1974. Let's go to June 4th, 1974. The Cleveland Indians were hosting the Texas Rangers. To understand 10-cent beer night, you have to understand baseball in the 70s. This was a different world. Ballparks weren't the polished entertainment complexes that we see today. This is when the AstroTurf was taking over and those round utilitarian stadiums that people hated so bad because they played football and baseball on them. And you could just build one turf surface and play two sports on it and so forth. Those huge concrete oval stadiums that now most of us hate. Yeah, they had their charm, but looking back at them, you know, not so popular other than for nostalgic reasons, in my opinion. They were loud, gritty, unpredictable, and promotions were a big part of getting fans, you know, in the seats. So the Cleveland Indians were struggling in the early 70s. They hadn't been a contender since the late 50s, and so attendance was kind of mediocre, and ownership was looking for ways to get fans excited again. Sounds kind of like the plot to the 1989 baseball movie Major League, right? So the team leaned heavily, as do a lot of teams, on promotions. Cheap beer, discounted tickets, giveaways. So basically, they were operating how minor league teams operate now, if you really think about it. We have a minor league team, 30 minutes from my house that we've enjoyed watching over the years, and they literally have a promotion for every single home game. And I first came to minor league baseball watching things like the Mrs. Dynamite blow herself up in the box and Little People Wrestling and Junker Car Night and all kinds of things to get people in the seats. At this point in their history, Cleveland and other teams probably were doing some similar type stunts. And by the way, Cleveland fans, before I go any farther, I am not dogging on your city or your team or your stadium back then or anything. I've actually enjoyed a night in attendance at the current Cleveland ballpark, and I had a fantastic times. It is a great place to watch baseball at the current stadium in Cleveland. So we had a great night there when I went. So I'm not condemning you guys in any way. This is just one of those weird events in life. They do anything to fill the seats back then, and Cleveland needed people in the seats. Cleveland Municipal Stadium back then seated 70,000 people. But many nights in the 70s, it barely drew 10, 12, 15,000 people. So the team decided to do something bold and something, to be honest, inexpensive. I digress for a second to mention that one of the promotions I went to in Little Rock for the Travelers was a lot of times they would bring back former players who played in the system that their minor league team was in. At the time, we were a Cardinal system team, AA team, and they brought Lee Smith back, and I stood right beside him and didn't realize it was him until a few minutes later when I saw him again walking back the other way. I stood right beside Lee Smith by the concessions or something one night. So, yeah, a lot of different things happened to bring people in. So Cleveland's idea was to get a lot of attention. And so in 1971, the Indians had actually had nickel beer night, and they had zero problems. Zero problems just 3 years earlier with nickel beer, okay? Didn't have any issues. So here we are in 1974, and they had the same idea again. Beer for 10 cents. Now, I looked it up, and that's the equivalent to about 65 cents today. And normally, that's what the beer would cost back then full price, which would be about $4.24 today. So they were going to sell $4 beer for 65 cents or 65-cent beer for a dime, however you want to look at it. But on this night in June of 1974, the price would be a dime, and it sounded pretty reasonable to everyone involved. Fans could buy 6 beers at a time. Now, we've all been to concerts and ball games, and usually they'll let you know there is a limit on how many you can physically carry away from the concession stand. So that night, they limited it to 6 beers at a time. Let's not forget that part of the phrase, at a time. But there was no limit to how many times you could go back and get 6 beers. So think about that. 6 beers per purchase, 10 cents each, and unlimited trips. So in hindsight, you can probably see where this story is going. But the team thought it would just fill the seats, and it did. More than 25,000 showed up that night, which was double their normal turnout. But what the Indians couldn't have anticipated was just how much beer they would actually drink that night. Now, I suppose this is hard to prove, but my research says that they estimate they sold 60,000 cups of beer at 10 cents a piece. And so that means one thing. They had a stadium full of very intoxicated people, right? So let's pause right there and talk about the baseball side of this. Let's back up and tell how this all really started 6 days earlier on the actual field. This is a key piece of the story. This wasn't the night of just any game. Now, by the way, they couldn't have planned for this. There's no way they could have known this was going to happen, the people in Cleveland planning this. Just 6 days earlier, the Indians and the Rangers had gotten into a huge bench-clearing brawl in Texas at Arlington Stadium. Indian fans were still mad about that. That incident was from a hard slide on defense, followed by a runner putting up a forearm and putting the old forearm shiver into a fielder during a bunt play. And a brawl erupted from all that. And when the Indians returned to their visitors' dugout at that point, because they were in Texas, they were pelted with food and beer beverage, everything from the Texas fans. It says beer, beverages, and food. And the Rangers went on and won that game 3-0. The Texas fans came unglued on them and threw all this stuff at them. A Cleveland reporter after the game down in Texas asked the Texas manager, Billy Martin, yes, that Billy Martin, if he feared going to Cleveland, because the reporter knew they'd be up there in a week. And Martin replied that Cleveland didn't have enough fans in the stands to even worry about, and I'm paraphrasing. So keep in mind, newspaper was everything back then, and so was local news on TV. So you've got an Indian fan base who's mad that their own players were treated this way in Texas, and then making the rounds in the papers all over the country the next morning was the Texas manager saying, we're not worried about the return trip because they don't have anybody in the stands anyway. So tempers were already high, and players didn't forget, of course. They were already angry, and now the fans are fired up too, okay? So Cleveland sports radio, which also is a big deal in bigger cities, of course, helped pour gasoline on that fire. Local sports show radio personality Pete Franklin spent days hyping up the rematch. And there was another radio broadcaster with him, Joe Tate, who was, I think, on the Cleveland's actual game broadcast on radio. They mocked the Rangers. They encouraged Cleveland fans to show up and show their displeasure with the Texas Rangers. And so by the time the Rangers arrived in Cleveland, the crowd that's already mad about a previous event just 6 nights ago is looking for a fight. And they're mad, and they show up on Dime Beer Night. So, hopefully, that sets the stage for you to understand what happened 6 nights later in Cleveland. And from the start, this night supposedly just felt different. People who were at the game later told the media that it just felt like a weird vibe all night from the very beginning anyway. And even before the first pitch, fans were getting kind of rowdy. People were chanting things at the Rangers. Beer was flowing, of course. By the way, the beer was supposed to be 3.2% alcohol, but they also sold some Stroh's beer that was at about 5 to 6% alcohol strength. So mixed in with what was supposed to be low alcohol per volume beer, you ended up with some that was almost twice as strong in the mix as well. So sure, that had a role in this. And security at the stadium was way too minimal for this. Keep in mind, 3 years earlier, they had nickel beer night and no problems. So they saw no need to beef up security. And anyway, back then, security wasn't what it is today at the ballpark anyway. There were a few ushers and some police officers, but nothing like the sort of the layered security that we have now, where you're walking through and getting scanned, and there's people walking the concourses and people down by your seats and all. Nothing like that. So once the game got started, the crowd got louder and drunker and a little rowdier with every inning. And pretty soon the first fan ran onto the field. The Rangers had a pitcher named Ferguson Jenkins. Yes, that Ferguson Jenkins. And he was nailed in the torso by a line drive while he was pitching. The line drive comes back, hits him in the ribs or something, and the Cleveland fans actually cheered. And this fan ran onto the field, and he sprinted across the outfield before being tackled. The crowd, of course, loved it. And soon after that, yet another fan ran onto the field, and then another. And then a woman ran out and flashed part of the crowd. Topless flashed part of the crowd and tried to kiss the umpire behind the plate. I think it was the home plate umpire. That umpire had no idea what to do. He tried to push her away while security slowly kind of made their way onto the field, but the interruptions after that even just kept coming. At one point, a streaker ran and slid into second base. That's what the research says. And another fan ran out with his son, and both men mooned the crowd. So that's what the research says. And by the middle innings, this game had become really secondary to the absolute circus happening in and around the stands. I found multiple sources for every one of those things I just mentioned as far as incidents, by the way. As the beer continued flowing, the atmosphere started changing and things got a little bit darker. The jokes and the pranks got a little bit stranger. Fans started throwing stuff, cups, hot dogs, food, Somebody started throwing lit firecrackers and in the stands. They were lighting them and throwing them down the row or whatever and blowing them up on the concrete pavers underneath the stands. Some they started throwing out onto the field. Some people started throwing things like rocks. And the Rangers dugout, you know how the dugout sits right below the front row there. They started pelting it with stuff, debris. All right. First baseman Mike Hargrove, who later was a manager. He might have been the manager at Cleveland, was he? I don't know. I don't remember. But first baseman Mike Hargrove for the Rangers was hit with food, and they were spitting food at him. At some point, an empty bottle of Thunderbird alcohol was launched at Hargrove as well, but missed. Because, the first and third basemen are kind of vulnerable, because I say that because there's a fence between the catcher and the crowd, but first and third base, they're close to the action with no nets on their side, and obviously the outfielders, but of the infielders, I guess the shortstop and second baseman are kind of the safest. So players started dodging objects that were flying out of the stands, basically. And apparently at some point, someone threw firecrackers lit into the Rangers bullpen. Now, meanwhile, some fans started ripping the seats up out of the stadium and tearing them up. And this thing had 70,000 seats in it. And so 25,000 fans, some percentage of them was getting drunk and literally destroying the seats. I don't know how you do that, because those things are bolted in pretty well to concrete. So I don't know how they get ripped up. I'm just telling you what I read in the research. Some people who weren't taking part in the drunken behavior started leaving early. But of course, the most intoxicated people hung around, and the mood got even worse. And let's not forget, an actual baseball game was still going on, and it was a close one. The Rangers had an early lead, but the Indians had fought back. And heading into the ninth inning, the score was tied 5-5. So a lot of fans had left, but some of these drunk fans obviously remembered what had happened earlier in the week. But the baseball had become really an afterthought because of the fan behavior, people sneaking onto the field, and security got overwhelmed pretty quickly, and the Rangers players started getting nervous, and then something happened that really changed everything. In the bottom of the ninth inning, a drunk 19-year-old fan, that's what the research said, ran onto the field. Now, he sprinted towards Rangers outfielder, a guy named Jeff Burrows, and the fan tried to grab Burrows' cap, and Burrows kind of was surprised by all this, and he sort of stumbled trying to dodge the guy or whatever. He didn't know that he was just coming to remove his cap, I guess. He probably thought he was being attacked. And that's exactly what the Rangers players around him thought, as well as Rangers manager Billy Martin. They thought the guy intended to harm him. So they charged out of their dugout to defend their teammate, and some of them had bats in their hands when they did it. So the moment, though, that the Rangers stepped out of that dugout and onto the field, the crowd exploded, and hundreds of fans poured out out of the stands and onto the playing field. Fans tossed foreign objects at the Rangers, who had run out to help their teammate, from the bleachers. A lot of fans carried whatever they could use to swing at somebody, including pieces of the bleacher seats that had been ripped out. And I would imagine the arm of a bleacher seat would hurt. And allegedly, within seconds, the field was flooded. And I don't know who said this, but I saw a quote where 200 fans surrounded 25 Rangers players out on the field. And fights started breaking out, and fans were still throwing things. And along with the bolted-in stadium seats, there were folding chairs in the stands in some areas, and those were being brought out onto the field. At one point, Indians pitcher Tom Hilgendorf was hit in the head by a chair thrown from the stands. Yeah, Indians pitcher. This was their own player in the head with a chair. The umpire was also struck by debris, and he had a head wound open up. They cut him in the head. The scene looked more like a battlefield than a baseball game, some of the observers said. And here's where things really get crazy. Cleveland players actually grabbed their bats, and they tried to help the Rangers players off the field safely away from the fans. I read somewhere that the Cleveland manager said, if we don't get out there and help the Rangers, somebody's going to get killed. And so the Cleveland players, trying to help their Major League Baseball playing brethren out, they went out there to try to protect them from the home fans. And so finally the umpires had seen enough, and they called the game, but not due to suspension. They actually declared a forfeit and awarded the game to the Texas Rangers. And I'm assuming that's because the game got out of control by the home fans, and so the home team had to lose because of that due to forfeit. So that was one of the most unusual endings in Major League Baseball history. The police eventually showed up and cleared the field, and it took a while. Fans, meanwhile, had stolen the actual bases off the infield, just uprooted them and took off with them. They had ripped up parts of the actual turf. Now, I really don't remember if it was a turf as an AstroTurf, artificial, or if it was still grass at that point. I can't remember. But they literally pulled chunks of whatever it was up and left with it. And pieces of the stadium itself were just scattered everywhere. And keep this in mind, only 9 people were arrested. I'm assuming that's just the ones they could corral, handcuff, and arrest. A lot of people got injured, and the whole thing, the riot itself, the fight, the melee, was to about 20 minutes worth of action. So, 20 minutes of chaos, and only 9 people arrested. I really don't know why that number was that number, but that's what it says. Obviously, Major League Baseball realized that promotions involving unlimited alcohol were a problem. But Cleveland, incredibly, believe it or not, this is the wildest part of all of this. Cleveland, incredibly, had 10-cent beer night 2 weeks later. Are you kidding me? They had 10-cent beer night again 2 weeks later. Major League Baseball may have been tired of it, but they didn't tell them not to do it, apparently. And 41,000 people showed up for beer night 2. Well, 3 if you count the one in 1971. 41,000 showed up for the second beer night of 1974. And they had 0 incidents that night. None. How that happened? Who knows? But that's what the research says. In fact, in general, the Major League started implementing some rules about limiting how many beers you could purchase at a time per customer. You know, Cleveland started using, for the second beer night, they used something like 200 police officers. And, of course, stricter enforcement. You know, a lot of people have heard of stadium jail. Most stadiums, I say most, I don't know if that's true, but a lot of stadiums had drunk tanks in them, is what we call them. But small jails where they can literally lock you up for the event. So, I don't know. A combination of things made it to where almost twice as many people had 0 problems. So, that was Cleveland Beer Night 3. So, today, by the way, I think you're still limited at any ballpark anywhere. You're only going to get 2 beers probably per adult buyer to carry back to your seat. I think that's probably universally a rule. So I'm sure rules affecting alcohol sales were changed and enforced going forward, because 10-cent beer night is remembered as one of the most bizarre events anywhere, anytime in sports history. And there are other famous promotions, and one that I was tempted to talk about, and I still probably will because it's a fun one as well. You probably, when you heard about this podcast, you probably thought this is what I was going to talk about. But Disco Demolition Night is another story that we'll talk about, but that's a famous one too. But 10-cent beer night, it might hold the crown. I'm not sure. I'll have to do the research on the other one. Players literally had to fight their own fans on behalf of the visiting team. That's how bad this night was. So it's a reminder, man, back in the 70s, things were just different. And why would professional baseball be any different, right? Some of this stuff was a little bit on the risky side. I mean, blowing up dynamite in a box with a person in it, hey, normal part of the deal back in the 70s and 80s and 90s at the ballpark, for example. Sometimes things just got out of control. I would imagine most clubs, most events, they're a lot more capable of handling this kind of stuff now. So there you go. I mean, 10-cent beer night, man. It's one of those stories that sounds too crazy to be true, really. And can you imagine now announcing that there's 50-cent beer night or something at a stadium. And it's unlimited. No, I know one thing. I wouldn't be going to that. One of my triggers out in the world is rowdy drunks for sure. And I don't think I could sit through, 10-cent beer night anywhere right now, especially unlimited. And you couldn't expect it to be a nothing go wrong kind of event, right? But that's what in Cleveland in 1974, they expected to get away with this because they had in 1971. So, hey, they were 2 for 3, not having any major incidents, right? And it became one of the most crazy nights in sports history. And I'm sure somebody listening to this hopefully knows someone who was there. Maybe you were there. I don't know. But if you weren't, you still hear this story when people talk about crazy stuff happening at ballparks, right? I don't think anybody got severely injured that night, thank goodness. And that's a silver lining here. But anyway, when you think about the 70s and just kind of unhinged, it seems like sports could be back then. This is a great example. So I thought that was a fun story. I enjoyed researching it and telling you about it. I hope you enjoyed that 26 or 7 minute walk down memory lane. Hey, if you like what we do here, remember to tell somebody about us. Some crazy stuff has happened since this podcast started. We started out publishing every 2 weeks, and our numbers actually went down when I started publishing every week. Our numbers actually went down a little bit. Really sure what that's all about, but I kind of committed to doing weekly for this year, and I am going to do my best to do that, but I don't know. We'll see how it goes on the weekly or bi-weekly thing in the future, because it's just kind of interesting to me that we have more listens when we were only putting one out every 2 weeks. So whatever. I don't know what that really means, but I appreciate you spending half an hour with me, if it's weekly or whatever it is. And so we'll be back in a week with some more baseball, and I appreciate your time as always. And this has been Sean Enos for GenX Classic Sports.
Thank you for joining us on GenX Classic Sports, where nostalgia meets the thrill of the game. Tune in next time for more insightful discussions and memorable moments, brought to you by Pine Street Productions. Until then, stay passionate about sports and keep the memories alive.